Gaylord Brothers. I'd like to welcome everyone to the second webinar we've put on in partnership between Gaylord Brothers and Syracuse University. As you know, our topic today is planning for disaster, and I would like to introduce our presenter, David Stokoe. David is Syracuse University's Rare Book and Paper Conservation Library in the Department of Preservation. His responsibilities include undertaking and managing all conservation procedures and treatments, primarily with rare book and manuscript materials, and also with exhibition preparation and installation. David teaches classes for museum studies and School of Information Studies programs, as well as workshops for local libraries and heritage organizations. And is very relevant today, he is the leader of the university's library disaster response team and is responsible for all aspects of planning, training, reaction, and equipping for disasters. David has over 30 years of conservation experience in many US and UK institutions and is a certified, registered, and accredited member of the UK Society of Archivists. He's also a professional associate member of the American Institute of Conservation. David, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I'm presuming everybody can hear me. If not, Peter, please tell me. First of all, I'd like to welcome everybody, and apologies for the slight confusion at the beginning. There was a fire evacuation literally 12 minutes before we were due to start. It was a scheduled test, fortunately, otherwise I wouldn't be here, although I wish they'd told me about it. So welcome everybody. I'm going to go through the PowerPoint presentation. There are slides, there are videos, and Peter is going to be looking at questions, and we're probably going to have a question and answer session at the end, unless there's absolutely any very important issues that come up relating to a particular slide. So without further ado, we'll launch into the aims and scopes of this presentation. It is aimed primarily at libraries and archives. My work is mostly with special collections material, although everything we're going to deal with today is also relevant to circulating collections, but it is prominently about books. A lot of the material and theory does also apply to manuscripts and loose papers, but the demonstrations on the video are going to be predominantly books, as I say. I'm going to try and emphasize the importance of a disaster plan. I often say that if you leave it till the event happens, then it's too late. And my old scuba diving instructor used to have the mantra of plan the dive and dive the plan. And if you don't have a plan, you can be in serious trouble. And that's very true of this as well. So the demonstration and discussions of how to dry water damaged books are going to be video. I am going to be narrating them. You won't be able to hear the audio, so I'm hoping I can coordinate what I'm saying with the video in terms of the time scheduling. And so yes, I'll move on to the next slide. So 4 stages of disaster thinking: mitigation and prevention. As I've said before many times, prevention is better than cure. I'm sure everybody's heard this. In terms of prevention, if you can prevent things happening, it's less work, it's cheaper, it's actually better for the collections. They don't get wet and therefore have to be treated. They're still in pristine condition. It also means that you're ensuring continued service for your customers and access to materials. Preparedness, you need to be developing a plan, you need to purchase supplies, you need to identify and train team members and staff. Here we have what's called the DIRT team, well it's DRT, but we sneak an I in there. It's known as the DIRT team, Disaster Response Team. We also have compiled lists of all staff, all their phone numbers, their work number, their home number, their cell phone number, their emails, their response times, and this is actually mostly confidential to administrative staff. Our plan is actually drawn up in electronic form and printed on paper. so that in the event of something happening, we're not reliant on electricity and therefore a computer situation. The plan is actually printed onto plastic paper, so that in the event of you using it in a flood, if it does get wet, it's not going to fall apart and be part of the problem. Response, we want an immediate and effective response, and this is really down to prior planning. If we can familiarize ourselves with what we want to do, how we're going to do it, and the materials we're going to use, we have less panic. I'm not saying no panic, but certainly less panic. Supplies need to be at hand. We need trained personnel that can be contacted immediately through the phone list. Recovery. In terms of recovery, we're really looking at 3 options: replace, discard, or conserve, or dry, if you like. In terms of drying, we're looking at fan drying, or freeze drying, or vacuum drying, as it's often called. And replacement obviously can be either as a physical or an electronic copy. We're going to dry the books. We've talked about that already. And really, in terms of organizing resources for recovery, we need to be thinking about how much money we can or are willing to spend. We need to be aware of the cataloging implications and whether people will be able to make a good, quick decision on whether the item is worth keeping, and that's a lot down to cataloging. We need public relations in some instances where it's a large-scale event. We need to be having a press release, possibly even asking for volunteers, certainly asking for local help from the local community, local supermarkets, freeze-dry trucks, that kind of thing. Circulating books, if they get wet, really we can be offering alternative sources through interlibrary loans. So that's another option for water damaged material. So what is a disaster? 2 types, obviously, minor and major. And a minor we can generally deal with in-house. The majority are construction related, often resulting in small incidents, possibly from HVAC renovations or malfunctions, spills, overflows of sinks, toilets. Obviously that's a health and safety implication. We can have problematic roofs and gutter leaks. Small incidents can often lead to mold, and we need to be aware of that. Coated papers, or China glazed papers as they're sometimes called, need to be dealt with immediately and slightly differently to a regular paper stock. Coated papers will tend to stick together, and once they do that, there's absolutely no way of separating them. So any coated papers need to be interleaved as quickly as possible and dealt with very attentively. Major incidents, well, here on the East Coast, I'm not sure where everybody's listening from, but on the East Coast, we've had some fairly major incidents in the last week or so, and they seem not to have stopped now. I just heard the mayor of New Jersey saying that he was expecting plagues and pestilence coming any day soon after we've had the hurricane and then the snowstorm. And obviously a major incident is going to be much more catastrophic and may actually require, well, certainly will require external specialist help and possibly state or federal government funding to address the situation. But a fire, for instance, we're going to have the fire department here. They're going to be squirting water all over the place. They're going to be indiscriminate about where they're squirting it. We're not going to be allowed back in the building until they've thoroughly secured and wetted down every single part of the library or institution. And obviously the fire will do damage, but the water will cause damage too. And we're not going to get access to the building, certainly for a couple of days, until they've secured the area. And by then, again, we're talking about possibility of mold outbreak. We've got no controlled environment, so that's actually a big issue. So a minor incident, here at SU, we generally consider a minor incident to be less than 500 damp or wet books. And that's something that we can deal with in-house. We've got staff trained up, we've got the supplies, we've got the experience, we've got the manual. But it can be much less than 500. It can be, as in the slide, items returned by a patron. They've spilled their coffee, they've dropped the pizza on it. Leaky book drops can be a problem. Book drops need to be placed in a relatively sheltered environment, even if they are outside. You don't want them exposed too much. Work-related spills. I mean, we've had actual restroom incidents where a toilet has been running and not drained away. Fortunately, clean water, but flooded quite a large area of the 6th floor. And this is obviously something that it is quite stressful, and unless you know where your water cutoff is, then it's going to continue happening until you can get facilities to close it down. Building deficiencies. Older buildings are more prone to leaks and deterioration, roof leaks, all these kinds of things. Often, in my experience, when sprinkler systems are primed, when a fire is detected or even a false detection, I know in New York City, the street drains are not able to take the pressure of the water that's building up in a sprinkler system. And I've experienced numerous floods on the lower levels and basements because the sprinkler system can't release the back pressure into the street drains. So that's actually broaching into the next subject of a major incident. But so anything less than 500, we're going to deal with in-house, basically. This is actually a cart. Again, this is in New York City where I used to work. You may be able to see on the computer screen, it's something, it's actually Union Theological Seminary. Major grant work, lots of construction, lots of renovations. This wasn't a result of that. This was a faculty member's child left a tap running in a restroom up 2 floors above the archive store over the weekend. It wasn't discovered. And fortunately, it wasn't too bad, but a lot of loose documents and ephemera, as well as bound volumes, obviously on the top shelf there. And I think it probably was less than 500 items, but we still decided that this was going to be freeze-dried. So, yeah, being attentive of what's going on and having facilities aware of the possibilities is really quite imperative. And this is the ceiling of the rotunda, which is a couple of floors below the archive store. So on level 5, you've got the restroom. On level 3, you've got the archive store. Ground level or first floor was the rotunda, and the water came straight through every floor from top to bottom and made a real mess of this beautiful ceiling. Fortunately, it dried up and the staining disappeared, but it just goes to show that facilities crew and people in the know really need to be aware of where your damaged areas are, where your potential is, and not just what's evident to them at the time. So a major incident, more than 500 pieces, access is going to be restricted. You're probably going to, well, you certainly are going to require outside specialist help. As we've said before, it could be the result of a water main break, a fire, or a storm. It could be other things happening as well. Here at SU, we've had 3-inch water pipes. Somebody's tightened up a screw or a nut on it, and it sheared off and completely devastated a professor's office, and all his library and in his works and his papers. And a lot of that stuff was actually unrecoverable. So a large incident can really set you back, and it can stop the operation of the institution. It can also be a major hazard in terms of standing water, mixing with electricity. Obviously, you don't want to be going into a room that's flooded where there's electricity available. Shelves can collapse, books can be falling off the shelves, slippery floors, dirty water, people with allergies to mold and that kind of thing can have serious problems. And basically the building can be unsafe. Mold, larger disasters can take time to address, making mold growth much more likely. So that's a a big consideration. Smoke damage is obviously something that is not quite as troublesome to people with allergies, but it just adds to the whole nightmare, really. So here we have a video of a flash flood that occurred in April last year on the steps that I've just been standing on as we got evacuated for the fire drill. And the video is 24 seconds long. If you look at the water cascading down the steps, there's actually a grid behind the students' heads here, and this is where the intake or exhaust of the HVAC system is, and that feeds directly down into the sub-basement. So fortunately, for most of us, the water went straight down into the basement, sub-basement, sorry, and didn't actually hit any of the library floors. So I'm going to open this up and so I'm not sure if people can actually hear the soundtrack for that, but it's pretty self-explanatory, and this webinar will be recorded and made available, and everything is linked up with hyperlinks, so you'll be able to watch that at your leisure sometime in the future. There's actually buildings across here which you can't see because of the sheer amount of rain that was coming down, and we lost power to various parts of the building. Peter and I were actually in the Belfer audio lab with absorbent booms blocking the doors to stop the audio lab from flooding, so we didn't actually witness this, but there was an evacuation because of the fire alarms, so everybody had to go and stand outside in this rain as well, which is even more unpleasant than today. Here's just a picture of what can happen in a flood. Obviously, there's probably at least 2 or 3 shelving levels below water level here, and hopefully everything on the top levels has not been too damaged. When books do get wet, they tend to expand, so anything that's tightly packed onto the bookshelves will be very difficult to remove, and may require the end of the shelf bay to be pried open to allow the books to be removed. So that's one thing to bear in mind. Fortunately, when books are tightly packed, they tend to absorb less water. There's less options for the water to get into the middle of the text block, which kind of minimizes some of the damage. If it's a book floating around freely in a bucket of water, it's going to take up much more water than it would do if it's tightly packed on a shelf. So yeah, this is kind of a freeze drying facility. It's not a particularly commercially sized one. It's an option that we used to use in New Jersey, and freeze drying is really a something to resort to when you've got more than 500 items, or sufficient that you can't deal with it in-house, or sufficient that there are certain important books which really need to be addressed as quickly as possible, historically important, financially important, etc. And basically, a freeze drying scenario would involve putting a book into a plastic Ziploc bag and blast freezing it as quickly as possible, so it's solidly frozen. Then you can store it in the freezer. You buy yourself some time. You can then decide what your priorities are. Is the book replaceable? Is it worth conserving? Making all of those curatorial decisions, and then you decide, yes, we're going to do it. So the thing goes to a freeze-dry facility, and the process is called sublimation. And it basically takes a frozen, iced-up book in a vacuum chamber at about 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The vacuum means that the ice will pass from the ice stage straight through to water vapor. It bypasses the water stage, therefore there's less swelling, there's less damage, and so it'll go ice to water vapor and then be drawn out. So basically you put a frozen book in there and you get a dry book out. And this is obviously highly advantageous in terms of the quick sort of drying options, as well as being able to minimize structural damage. When wet books tend to expand, the sewing structures get stressed, the leather will go black and crispy and gelatinous. The only downside of this situation is that, of the freeze-dry situation, is that sometimes you get leather burn during the process, and this is kind of similar to what you would get from a steak that you've had in your freezer for too long. So that's basically freeze drying. So how to prepare? Know and understand your disaster plan. You really need to be thinking about, if you haven't got one, you need one. Any institution, whether it's a library or a museum or any kind of small local history organization, all the way up to big universities, you really need to have a plan. You need to know your plan, and everybody else needs to know it, and you need to understand it. You need access to the plan. It's no good if it's only online. You need paper copies. As I said, plastic paper is obviously a better option. They're not particularly expensive. I think it's about 50 cents a sheet for standard-sized letter-sized paper. And they just run through a normal LaserJet printer. It's not a big deal. So we need regular trainings, sessions, and updates. Here at SU, we have 2 training sessions a year. We revise and update the plans. We check everybody's phone numbers and all of the personnel details, and basically just have a complete review of the whole thing once a year, as well as twice a year training. Coping strategies, as I mentioned before, we've got the DRT team, or the DIRT team. And we probably are going to get dirty if we end up reacting to a disaster. You're certainly going to get wet. We've already identified space to work in. We have various satellite libraries and offsite storage facilities. We were always thinking, if this happens at a certain location, what space do we have available? And you do need considerable amount of space to do this. And demarcation of processes. The disaster response team needs to be familiar with all of the aspects of saving and drying out wet books. Everybody needs to be quite proficient in all aspects of that, and we need to be really thinking about moving people around so that they're not doing the same process over and over and getting demoralized. Location of supplies, what and how to use them. We have them itemized in our disaster plan. We have them mapped out, and as I said, the training shows people what we have and how to use them. Administrative support, specialist help is obviously the freeze drying scenario. We would also be thinking about freezer trucks to get the stuff to a freeze dry facility in a timely manner and freezing it on the way. Conservation specialists, photographic specialists, works of art on paper specialists, that kind of deal. Medical facilities, people do get injured. People sue when they get injured. Some professors sue when their offices get flooded. Press release, we need PR, we need good PR, we need it to publicize the efforts we're making and possibly ask for other additional help from the community. Coping strategies. Staff should be prepared to deal with incidents where they occur. It's very difficult to move wet, heavy books from where they are to somewhere else. If we are going to move them, we're going to be looking at using plastic boxes because cardboard boxes are going to get wet and fall apart in transit. The locations of the disaster supply lockers are common knowledge. As I say, we tend to pass on all of this information at regular training sessions. Staff call-out lists, I think I mentioned before that they are deemed confidential from an HR point of view. There are few people in SU that are entitled to have the spreadsheet. It is password protected, and in the event of something happening, the people that are authorized are generally within the preservation department or at a level where they would be involved anyway. So whoever finds the disaster is going to get in touch with somebody that has access to all of this information. And know where to find help. Obviously here at SU, the preservation department is the first port of call. If you don't have a preservation department or a conservator or a specialist, really you should be looking for outside help or at least some advice by phone, and we will be looking at a resource page with some links at the end of this presentation. So creating a disaster plan, there's 2 links here that take you to some advice on how to do it, and also some sort of pro forma templates and workbooks. There are numerous of them out there. You could probably Google something. I know the second link there, CLRC, is the Central Library Resource Council. From their website, there are various options, D-Plan through the Northeast Documentation Conservation Center, and a lot of these workbooks and plans are actually freely distributed and downloadable, and you don't really need to try reinventing the wheel. You can just plug your name into the details and try and manipulate the document, getting in as many of the building criteria and problems as you can, and what your collections are and who your staff are, and etc., etc. So using blank forms and checklists is a good option. You don't need to write from scratch. But as the last point says, the need for constant revision is always there. We don't want a plan that's out of date and you try and phone somebody and they're not available. They retired 2 years ago or they moved on. And at that point, you're then stuck for who do you call? So we're also looking at not only revising the plan, but checking the contents of the disaster supply kits. Quite often, people think that, oh, I need a pair of scissors. I know there's one in the disaster supply kit. I can just borrow that out of there, or an extension cord, or a circuit breaker. And next thing you know, it doesn't go back in there. So what we do, we have a cable tie going through the plastic tote bins that all of this stuff is stored in. So you do need a pair of scissors to get in there, and it's quite obvious if the seal's broken, then somebody's been in there, and if there hasn't been a disaster, then you really want to know what's gone out of there, if anything at all. So yeah, revision in terms of staff, personnel, phone numbers, responsibilities, response times, how close do they live, how fast can they get there, this kind of deal. So prevention and preparedness planning. Identifying the staff. They need to be volunteers. They do not need to be press ganged because they won't turn up at 3 o'clock in the morning if they're press ganged. People need to be solicited according to the knowledge of a specific part of the collection to enable prioritized decisions to be made. You don't want somebody there, or you'd prefer somebody there that has knowledge of the collection and how important it is or how replaceable it is there duplicates available, etc. And the second point, the organizational sheet is again about phone numbers and duties and responsibilities, which we've kind of covered in part already. Procedures for recovering materials in our plan, which is online, and one of our links later on directs you straight to our plan and our preservation web pages. It outlines the recovery procedures for pretty much each format that we deal with. It's books, plans, photographic materials, etc., parchment, and gives you a breakdown of each format and what it requires to enable it to be conserved in the future or preserved at this time. So different formats require different responses. And number 4, annual review. I can't stress this enough. Keep it a live document. It needs to be up and running all of the time. And regular staff training sessions and basic recovery techniques, which we're doing as well. So here we have the presentation on recovering a wet book. And when I filmed this, it's like 9 minutes long, and I did narrate it, but the narration doesn't come through in the video on a webcast. So I'm actually going to try and talk you through this, and I did have bullet points written down according to time scales, but when I show it, the time scales don't come up. So bear with me. I shall try and keep this as accurate as possible. I'm going to demonstrate how to dry it out. And it's a cloth-bound book. It's been sitting in a bucket of water to simulate a flood, probably for about 28 to 30 hours. It was due for being deaccessioned and discarded, so we haven't hurt a book that's important. You can see that the book cloth, the filler in the book cloth is going soft, and the green pigment and the filler is now dripping out along with the water. And the book is obviously quite stressed. It's heavy. The text on the spine has disappeared. The label is coming off, which if you have a lot of items, once you've lost the call number off the spine and the text label, really, how are you going to identify it amongst the other 500 or more? So identifying a book is actually quite a big problem if you lose all of the details on the spine. So the adhesives, probably going to be water soluble, so the longer it sits in water, the more the adhesives are going to dissolve, and the thing is going to start to delaminate. Things are going to start to come apart. I think on this particular one, the cover is coming away. The glue holding the spine liner has given in. The spine lining cloth is now off along with the rest of the case. The joint's broken open. You can see I'm scraping off a load of water-soluble glue, and it's going to be a bit of a mess. The end papers are coming away. The cloth turn-ins on the boards are already splitting off. And yeah, you can see that the paste downs, there is a barcode showing there, but yeah, on the inside, which won't be very helpful if you've lost the call number off the spine. So the book was not completely open in the water. It was in a large tub of water, probably with about 4 or 5 other books, and which was kind of simulating them floating around in a relatively closed environment. So the water penetration has not gone all the way through the text block. It tends to kind of limit to the perimeter of the book, and the center where the text is doesn't necessarily get as soaked as the outside. And as I said before, the tighter the books are packed on a shelf, even if there's water dripping on them, the better in some respects, because the water will not penetrate through the head of the book and soak it all the way through. So to deal with it, we really need to be as sympathetic in our handling as possible so it doesn't get worse. We begin by putting paper towels, and these are just regular sort of restroom type paper towels, above and below, and squeezing out as much of the loose water as possible. You can see it coming out of the head there. The trouble with this process is that if the adhesives are not holding the cloth onto the boards, you can slide the cloth around and do some damage. So direct pressure downwards rather than at an angle. I'm using the paper towels here as a support to turn the book over, so I'm minimizing the amount of handling. I'm just going to use those to flip it over, giving it support as I go, and get all of the wet towels out of the way as quick as possible so you're not contaminating with more water, and then just squash it from the other side, straight down pressure, and again get rid of the wet towels as quickly as possible. So once we've done a quick pressing of the outside, we need to think about how we're going to dry out the interior of the book. And these paper towels are actually quite a good size. I'm just there trying to figure out what's the most economical way to get paper towels in there. And we don't want to be overloading the book with too many paper towels, because this could put undue pressure on the sewing structure and cause the spine to split. So if you put a towel between each individual page, really you're doubling the thickness of the book and are going to cause as much damage as you're trying to resolve. So I'm suggesting, depending on the size of the book and the thickness of the book and the amount of water, it's kind of a judgment call. I would say possibly between 5 and 15 or 20 pages. It's kind of a judgment call. I'm starting at the front and interleaving carefully. I'm trying not to open the book too far open, which will, I mean, this is a demonstration version. If it was a real important book, I wouldn't be opening it quite as wide as that, but I'm sliding paper towels in and just opening it at a fairly low angle, so as not to cause undue stress to the binding. And I don't think in this video that I go all the way through. I'm just demonstrating. You can see water bubbling out of the head there. So I would go all the way through the book from front to back, and then we would flip the book over. I think I'm about to do that. Yeah, with a bit of pressure, you can see that it's already soaking up. Normally I would just leave these paper towels in here, go all the way through to the front, to the back, and then start again, removing them and then putting fresh ones in. You can see that some towels are soaking up more water than others, and they're absorbing more at the spine area and on the head, the tail, and the foredge. So once I've gone all the way through and interleaved, I'd turn the book over, take out the wet towels, and then start again at the beginning. Excuse me, I'm just going to see where I'm up to in terms of the timing here. Right. So the trick is to get as much of the water out as possible by interleaving, and then we need to look at drying the book further. And really the best way and only way to do this is to stand it up on its edge and use household circulation fans to circulate cold air, and keep on rotating the pages that are open so that you get as much airflow through it as possible. There I'm demonstrating that underneath the fanned out book is not quite as supported, because the squares on the edges of the book mean that the case is actually deeper than the text block. So if you are going to do this, you really need to be supporting the text block with a piece of board underneath this area of the text block, so that it doesn't drop forward with the weight and the gravity of the water and pull itself out of the case. So yeah, piece of board underneath, leave it, come back to it every couple of hours, and just open it at different pages and keep it going until the thing is dried out. It possibly could take a day or two, it could take longer, it depends on the saturation levels. But obviously, I've already said this, but cooling fans, cold or room temperature air, you do not want to be using hot air. It will encourage mold growth. And if you have a dehumidifier, that will certainly allow the air to take up more moisture and dry out the book quicker than it would otherwise. Sorry, let me check the time scale again. So yeah, the more you handle the book, the worse it's going to get. So minimal handling. You're also going to be pulling the adhesives away from what they're stuck to. And really, if they keep in contact as the book dries out, the adhesives will re-adhere the cloth. They will possibly re-adhere the spine liner. So more handling is more damage in the long run. But once we've dried it out as much as possible, we're going to put it between two pieces of binder's board and try and get it back to the shape that it was before, and put a couple of bricks on top, or if you have a book press, you could put it in a book press, and that will just allow it to regain its it'll flatten out, and to some degree it'll regain the best shape that it can. It's probably not going to be as good as when it was originally bound, obviously, and there will be some warpage and some distortion in places. I think we may have finished there. Yes. Okay. So mold. Mold spores are everywhere. All they're really looking for is a place to grow with a nutritious food source. They need the right temperature. They need the right humidity. Some of them prefer the dark, not necessarily always, but and they come in lots of different varieties, lots of colors, lots of textures. People with allergies can be badly affected by them. Some of them can be fatal at times, I hear. Certainly debilitating and cause some serious health issues. They weaken paper, they discolor it, they stain it, and really we want to be avoiding mold problems at every opportunity. Mold abatement should be done outside, outside or in a fume hood. Soft brushes to brush the stuff into a vacuum, a HEPA vacuum standard cleaner, or outside, stand upwind of the stuff, get it off the paper as much as possible or off the book cover with a soft brush. There are instances where an alcohol spray can be used, which kind of kills to some degree a lot of mold spores. Ethyl alcohol, not vodka. It can also make book cloths, the coloration bleed, so obviously you would need a trained conservator if you're going to go down that road of using an antiseptic alcohol spray, an antibacterial. So prevention is better than cure, and with that in mind, we're really looking about control of the temperature and the humidity. And above 70 Fahrenheit, it's really going to get problematic, and certainly above 70 relative humidity again. But if you combine those two, then you're really suffering from double jeopardy and asking for big problems. But as I say, mold spores are everywhere. All we can really do is to try and control the environment to the point where they can't grow. They won't grow on inorganic materials. So that's something to be aware of. I've had instances where insulation has looked as though it's had mold problems, and actually it's not. It's just been dust that's accumulated through time. Also, not all that appears to be mold is necessarily mold. On leather bindings, a lot of salts can start to leach out of the leather and appear to be mold, but are not really. So if you're in doubt, then consult a chemist or a specialist conservator. We don't really want to take any chances. So here we have a prime example of mold on paper. This has obviously been folded, been wet. You can see the staining. A lot of this mold is quite thick. It was removed with a soft brush in a fume hood, an extraction hood. A lot of the staining doesn't disappear. We can actually wash the paper to some degree. A trained conservator could, but it's not really going to reinvigorate the text that has started to disappear in places. So really this item requires full conservation treatment in terms of dry cleaning, washing, deacidification and repair. And right now, being a health hazard as it is, it's probably not producible in a reading room of a special collections library. So I certainly wouldn't allow that into a reading room. Short video here. This is a sort of demonstration that we did here. It's kind of almost time-lapse photography, and shows a book under controlled and enclosed circumstances with a lot of water. And we actually wrote "Mold Me" in gelatin on the front cover to see if that would be the first area that would start mold growth. It didn't actually happen that way, but I'll play the video and you can see. So this was throughout a month, and you can see the temperature is in the high, certainly the low to high 70s. The humidity is very high. We had a data logger in there to record, and you can almost just make out where it says mold me on the front cover. And the mold actually started growing around the outsides, which was quite surprising to us, but it's growing a lot of the places. And on the inside cover where it was closed is actually the worst area, which again was a bit surprising. So establishing collection priorities. We're really looking at identifying what collections you would drag out of a building first. And with that in mind, I would think about mapping out on a physical floor plan where your stuff is and color coding it or having a numeric prioritized system. You want to be thinking not only just about individual items, but collections as a whole. Duplicating vital records such as catalog entries, finding aids. If you've got microfilm, microfiche, you want to be making duplicates and having a master copy off in a safe situation, which is kind of standard procedure anyway. You possibly want to be talking about facsimiles as a safeguard, or even having your duplicates, well, your original records off-site and having duplicates available in terms of photocopies or digital or microfilm. But that's kind of a use-driven argument. So are people going to be satisfied with a digital version or a photocopy or a facsimile? And not always the case, I'm afraid. So ranking collections is quite an important thing. The things to consider: historic value, monetary uniqueness, ability to replace. Those are all really high up there. Ownership is possibly another one. You may have collections that are not actually yours, but on loan or gifted. And that's another aspect you probably should be considering. So identifying and eliminating potential disasters. As I said before, older buildings are more prone to problems. A building audit is always a useful thing. In terms of water systems, you can be thinking about restrooms, internal drains, fire hoses, sprinkler systems. Sprinkler systems are generally in libraries and archives and repositories a dry pipe system, meaning that the pipes are dry until a smoke detector is alerted, and then it triggers a solenoid to pump the dry system full of water, and then they would release locally at each sprinkler head when enough heat builds up to break that particular plastic or rubber seal. So sprinkler systems need regular maintenance. I think it's every 4 years. External features: gutters, roofs, drain pipes, proximity of trees, proximity of rivers and creeks. Only last week or the week before, we were down at one of our facilities. The creek was a possible flood in the event of Hurricane Sandy, so we were down there trying to figure out, were we subterranean, what safeguards we had in place. We then restocked and updated our disaster supply kit. We were fully aware of the potential. Fortunately, nothing happened. But all of those things. Also, what buildings are around you? Swimming pools, incinerators, power plants, nuclear power stations. Obviously, those are the more extreme ones. But I've had calls from local history people who their collections are housed in a building that has somebody living above or below, and or even a pet shop nearby, and there's obviously some issues there in terms of pest control, etc. So all of these things are really things that you should be looking at. And yeah, fire exits, smoke detectors, identify trouble spots. If you can do a building audit of all of these kinds of things with your facilities people or risk management, then that's really going to address and be a good preventative measure. And you really need to document all of these events and have them regularly updated. And as I say, drawing up floor plans, if you can identify where your shut-off valves are for the sprinkler system, for your power. All of these things generally need to be shut off using a key, which is obviously a building's facilities manager's task. And I know our sprinkler system has a shut-off wheel on it, but there's a filthy great padlock and chain around it. So it needs to be turned off by somebody that's fully authorized. Obviously, we don't want people turning them off because there's a slight leak and then it doesn't get switched back on and you have a fire and the sprinkler system wasn't live. So there's a lot of things to consider there. So a paper trail for all of these events is a really good idea, and I would certainly recommend that. In terms of response kits, this is a list of what we have in all of SU Library's response kits. Absorbent booms are a great idea. We've got them in 4 or 10 foot lengths. They generally absorb about 1 gallon per foot, and those can actually prevent some bigger issues. If you have a flood that's progressing towards another area, you can contain it. You can, with the 4 foot ones, they're wide enough to put across a door so that it doesn't make it underneath a door and into another room. The other ones are all pretty self-explanatory. There are whistles mentioned on there, which always raises an eyebrow. I think it's you know, in the event of lots of noise from the fire department and the water gushing by, a whistle, you would be able to attract somebody's attention. I think that's the theory behind it. Plastic sheeting is a must, and we have quite a good stock of plastic sheeting in the 100 feet roll. I think it's actually 12 feet by 100, although it says 10 here. And that kind of material is great. If you've got a leak coming in from above, you can cut off as much as you want and drape it over your stacks and just divert the water away from your book stacks or your collections. The rest of them, there's a lot of personal protective equipment in there. Some things hopefully you would not need. But that's a sort of generic list, and again, that's all listed in our disaster plan kit and available online. This is a first floor plan for the Bird Library here, and it X marks the spot of where the disaster plan kit is, and we have a map for each of our 6 floors with an X marking where the kits are, and these are obviously one of the focal points of our training and our training sessions to make sure people know where the supplies are. So water kits, this is actually the promotional stuff from a Gaylord React pack. And I was going to say on the last slide that if you wait till you have a disaster, it's too late to buy the supplies then. You've really missed the boat, pardon the pun. So yeah, Gaylord does some pretty good React packs and other not preventative, but reacting supplies. That's actually a picture of the React pack, and it's pretty self-explanatory. It's a basic kit. The good thing about this is that the box that everything fits into can also be used to carry away wet books. It's a plastic corrugate, and it's lightweight, and it will not collapse when it's full of wet books, so you can use it to transport your stuff away from the scene. So this is a second Gaylord product, and there's a list of everything that's in there. This is a 2-person React pack, and it's pretty much the standard supplies that you would expect in this kind of a deal, and certainly worthwhile if you don't have a large budget and you haven't got the time and the resources to sit down and identify exactly what you want, where to get it from, and in what quantities, then this is actually a really good idea. You can just buy the whole thing in one slice. And here's our list of resources. I'm not going to click on all of them, but I will click on the SU preservation page. Excuse me, I've gone the wrong way. Sorry, I may have to minimize this. It's not coming up. Yeah, this is our disaster recovery manual, and that's quite a good image of one of my interns pressing water out of a book. Any leather that gets wet, as I said, is going to go black and crunchy. And this outlines a sort of introductory panel and lists our emergency numbers, and further on goes into drying techniques. That's actually the difference between two book covers of the same book. One got wet and one didn't. So that's a dramatic example of what can happen. And although we've still got the video, this is a kind of pictorial representation of how to interleave books. There's the fans, pressing books to try and get them back into shape, and goes through a lot of different formats, photographic, etc., etc. I'm not going to go through every single item. I'll get back to the presentation. And sorry, I've lost my place in here. We're down to the second last slide, I believe. So yeah, this slide has a lot of resources. As I said, the Conservation Online, NEDCC. The CLRC one is a good one. It points you at various pro forma blank documents where you can plug in your own details and do your own emergency planning online, and then just print out and save a copy. And the American Institute of Conservation is a good link. A lot of useful advice, the Library of Congress, etc. I should really have had the British Library in here, but I'll forgive myself. And thank you for all attending, and feel free to contact me. My email is missing off this. Apologies for that. I shall make sure that Amanda forwards it, or you can probably get in touch with us through this top link. So I hope it was useful to you, and as I say, feel free to contact me if you need to. My email, I'll just vocalize it. It's D for David, J for Jeremy, Stokoe, STOKOE, at syr.edu. And with that, I'm not sure if I'm handing it over to Amanda or Peter. Probably Peter.
Yes, we have a few questions coming in. The first from Vicky. Do you have recommendations for removing bad odors like cigarette smoke from books?
That's quite a common question, actually. There are a few options. Lots of fresh air, depending on your weather. One option would be to get a large trash can, probably plastic if possible, but metal if necessary, and have a supporting plinth in the bottom. If it's a book, you can put it inside of the trash can on top of the plinth, so it's raised off the floor. You can fan out the pages similar to the way I was drying that book there, and round the perimeter on the bottom of the trash can, you can put either non-odored cat litter, which absorbs smells, or charcoal. And those in the enclosed trash can, you'd probably have to put the lid on it and leave it for, I don't know, a couple or 3 days, maybe a bit longer. That actively absorbs some of the odors. It's not 100% foolproof, but it's the best that is available right now. I certainly wouldn't recommend Febreze. Does that answer the question?
I think so. Another question. Do you recommend drying books in-house if only one or two were damaged and of high value, or should all high-value items be freeze-dried?
If it's in-house and you have no conservation expertise and the books are extremely valuable and precious for whatever reason, I would contact a trained conservator immediately, even if it's just for some advice over the phone. It depends really on your location, if there's somebody close by or not, but I would certainly recommend consulting a professional before you do anything. I think for circulating books, not to demean them, but I think there's more room for maneuver. The expectations are lower, and there's more chance that the item could be replaced anyway.
Right, and I'll add to that, sometimes you have to start it in-house because the time that you're losing before mold growth starts in could cause a lot more damage. So you certainly want to stabilize it. In the worst case scenario, you could put the book in a Ziploc bag after gently squeezing out some of the moisture and then just put it in your freezer. Another question, do you have recommendations for dealing with water damage from salt water that would be different from your suggestions for fresh water? If so, what are they?
That's a good question. I'm kind of presuming, again, I would, depending on the value of the book, I would consult a professional, but as Peter said, freeze drying would probably be the best option. The salt content may affect the speed of freezing. I think it probably would. I think the book would certainly need to be broken down and washed and chemically stabilized if it's an important special collection book. I think possibly, again, for a circulation book, it's kind of what is your expectation, what is your long-term prediction of use for this book, is it replaceable, etc. But I think saltwater damage is certainly going to be more problematic than fresh water. And depending if it's a special collection books, I would certainly consult a professional with a view to having the whole thing properly conserved, which is obviously going to be time consuming and probably expensive, which again, you really need to be assessing how important the book is and what your expectations are.
Another question, do you have a resource of company names that freeze dry books?
I don't. The one that comes to mind instantly is Munters, which I think is a national company. There are regional services. I do have a list somewhere, but I don't have it at hand right now. We can probably put something together and make it available through Gaylord. But I think Munters is kind of the national leader in this kind of thing, and they don't just deal with books, they deal with all kinds of building emergencies. But there are numerous freeze-drying facilities and companies available on a regional level. It's not something that's very rare. It kind of happens, unfortunately, quite a lot of the time. And a lot of these companies don't just specialize in books. They'll freeze dry museum collections and personal archives. And there's a lot of different sized companies depending on what your need is. But I think we can possibly find a list of resources and have it available through Gaylord, through Amanda.
Right, and another suggestion along the same lines would be contacting the preservation department in your local or regional research library. They will probably have this information on call and can help out, or your library consortium. Another question had to do with, one second, when you have paperback books that need a little help standing up in front of a fan, what do you do?
You could possibly have a couple of boards the same size as the cover, and gently attach using paper clips or those bulldog clips. Attach stronger boards to the outside cover until it loses sufficient weight that it can stand up independently. Either that or have a weight on each side, like a brick upended, and just kind of wedge them open. You could also possibly put a smaller weight inside the opening of the fan in the middle of the book to kind of force it back into the two bricks. But yeah, paperbacks, they're going to be highly acidic, highly brittle. Any water damage is really going to be quite a problem for a paperback, given that the high lignin content and the combination with water, you're going to get some serious acid hydrolysis, and it's going to go brittle pretty quickly, and probably some pretty bad staining as well.
Another question, can vellum-bound books be safely freeze-dried?
Avoid at all costs if possible. It's vellum.
I'll second that.
Vellum and parchment, completely different medium. You can freeze dry leather, you can freeze dry cloth and paper and board. Vellum and, sorry, did I say, you can't do vellum and parchment. If vellum or paper, vellum or parchment gets wet, it tends to go translucent, and it's not recoverable. So if you can protect those formats at all, even if it's just through boxing or through finding a low-risk storage area, I would certainly recommend that.
Right.
Yeah, it's not good when it gets wet.
Another question has to do with they have the sense that that only high-value books should be dried. It's probably not worth it to dry circulating books. I asked the librarians here if they had any books they'd like to be marked for saving in case of disaster and got no response. Should this person be worried? How would you determine what books are irreplaceable, if any?
It's almost a cataloger's question or a curatorial question. And it's very specific to the individual book. If it's particularly expensive, and although I know a lot of books are these days, but art books, that kind of thing, specialist books can run $200, $300, $400 easily, and realistically, I would earmark them for saving. Obviously, possibly, today's sort of reference books, depending on subject, are a lot easier to find and replace, and possibly even have interlibrary loan arrangements so you could get a copy.
Right, and one of the things with this, you may well have insurance to cover a loss, but if you catch a book after that's been wet soon enough, and you dry it using the techniques that we show here, if it's a smaller disaster, or you get it freeze dried, the damage, you might need to send it out to a library binder. That might cost $10, $15 to have it rebound, but the book will still be very serviceable. If you don't do anything, you're going to be paying a lot more than that in the long term. So you really have to consider, how damaged are they? If you had a book like in the slide that David showed earlier, where the water was knee-deep in the stacks, and if it was raw sewage coming off a street, yes, those might be a complete loss. If it was something that got, a sprinkler head went off in a very localized area, clean water, those might be salvageable. But take a look at them and do try to salvage them, because at the end of the day, it may well be worth it monetarily. Are there any other questions? Well, if there aren't, we'd like to say thank you very, very much on behalf of Gaylord and Syracuse University Library. David, you did a great job. We got some good questions. Still have a few coming in. Yes, we will get the slides to you. Aaron, if you could send an email to Amanda Baker at Gaylord using the link that was provided initially, she will see to it that that gets to you. And thank you to everyone for coming, and we greatly appreciate it.
Peter, I'm going to pop in here at the end just to second that. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Peter and David, for helping us so much with this. I just put my email address in the chat box there, but I'll repeat it for everyone. That's amanda.baker@gaylord.com. Feel free to email me directly if you have questions or haven't gotten the link within the next week with the slides and the recording of the presentation, or if you have any questions about the subject, I can get questions to Peter and David if you would like to contact them as well. Again, thank you all for coming, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.